They say every murderer makes one fatal mistake. Tonight, in the Ivory Seance Killer, we shall discover what that mistake was. I am Arthur Hastings, and this is the Little Grey Cells, where we chronicle the extraordinary cases of my dear friend, Hercule Poirot. First-time listeners, do make yourself known. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which part of the world is listening tonight. So, Poirot your tisane, find a comfortable chair, and let us engage those little grey cells. The game, as they say, is afoot. Chapter 1. The House That Breathed. You will find it most interesting, mon ami, Dr. Alistair Wynne had written. The lady requires a scientific mind and perhaps a judicial one. He had said nothing whatsoever about a séance. Hercule Poirot arrived at Ashcombe Hall on a Friday afternoon in late October, when the light over the Sussex Downs had already begun its too-early retreat. The motorcar deposited him at the foot of a gravel drive, flanked by wind-bent yews, and he stood for a moment regarding the house with his head tilted slightly to one side. The gesture of a man listening for a false note in an otherwise competent orchestra. The hall was not ugly. It was, in its way, handsome. A broad Jacobean facade of pale stone that had weathered into the colour of old teeth, its many windows dark against the afternoon sky. But something about the proportions troubled Poirot. The east wing was slightly lower than the west. A chimney had been rebuilt at some point and not quite matched to its neighbours. Small things, perhaps. And yet, he smoothed his moustache with one gloved finger and proceeded up the drive. Inside, the warmth struck him at once, excessive, almost aggressive. Coal fires burned in every grate, and the air carried a compound of beeswax, cut chrysanthemums and something else, something faint and sweet. Poirot's nostrils flared very slightly. He said nothing. The butler who admitted him was a man of perhaps 50, with the contained, expressionless face that good service produces and long habit preserves. He gave his name as Briggs, took Poirot's coat with the practised ease of a man who had discharged that office 10,000 times, and led him toward the drawing-room with a step that was perhaps 1 degree too quiet. The step, Poirot reflected, of a man accustomed to listening. The drawing-room was a room that had seen better decades, and its ancestral portraits, gentlemen in stocks, ladies in improbable ringlets, gazed down from walls papered in a faded sage green. A long oval table dominated the centre, cleared of its customary ornaments and positioned with a precision that struck Poirot as deliberate rather than habitual. Along one wall stood a glass-fronted cabinet containing ivory carvings, fans, figurines, and what appeared to be a chess set of considerable antiquity and refinement. Poirot crossed to the cabinet. The chess set was arranged with care. And yet... He leaned forward, his hands clasped behind his back, and regarded the pieces with the attention another man might give a Vermeer. One bishop was missing. He straightened, turned, and became immediately aware that he was not alone. Lady Margaret Ashcombe stood in the doorway that connected to the morning room, a tall woman of 60 or thereabouts, dressed in black, that was not quite mourning and not quite fashion. Her hair was white and arranged with the severity of a woman who has made peace with age by imposing order upon it. Her face was fine-boned, intelligent, and composed with an effort that only the very observant would detect. Monsieur Poirot. Her voice was steady and gracious. Alistair has spoken of you most warmly. Lady Ashcombe. He inclined his head with continental courtesy. "Your house is most striking." "It is old," she said, as though that explained everything. "Or you will forgive us if we seem preoccupied. We have a full house this weekend, and preparations are somewhat involved." "But, of course, I understand there is to be a gathering of sorts." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. "A séance, Monsieur Poirot. I do not believe in disguising the word." He met her eyes. They were grey and level, and they held in them something that he recognized. Not grief precisely, but grief's close and more dangerous cousin. Conviction. "What, Madame Karska arrives this evening," Lady Ashcombe continued. "She is a remarkable woman. You will form your own opinion." Poirot already had begun to. He was shown to his room, a pleasant chamber on the first floor with a view across the chalk cliffs towards the iron-grey sea. And there he unpacked with his customary deliberateness, arranging his toilet articles in their precise order, and hanging his suits with the care of a man who considers disorder in small things to be the beginning of disorder in large ones. It was while he was thus engaged that he became aware of the portrait. It hung above the small fireplace in his room. A young man of perhaps 25, dark-haired with a fine, serious face. Edward Ashcombe, if the small brass plate at the bottom of the frame was to be credited, died 1928. The portrait was recent enough that the colours were still clear, and yet there was something about the position of the frame. A slight displacement, a lightness in the dust along the upper edge, that told Poirot it had been moved within the past week and rehung not quite where it had previously rested. He regarded the young man's painted face for a long moment. Dinner that evening was a lesson in the architecture of a fractured household. The dining room was candlelit, Lady Ashcombe's preference, one gathered, and the table was laid for 7. Poirot observed his fellow guests with the benign attention of a man who happens also, in his professional capacity, to miss nothing. Dr. Alistair Wynne, his host's ostensible purpose, proved to be a lean, energetic man of 60 with clever eyes, and the slight restlessness of a physician who considers most social occasions inferior to a good diagnostic puzzle. He greeted Poirot warmly, but with a certain distraction, as though some portion of his attention was permanently engaged elsewhere. His daughter Clara was a pale young woman of perhaps 28, bookish in the sense that suggests not mere habit, but genuine retreat. She wore grey, she said very little, but her eyes, when they moved across the table, moved with a precision that Poirot found interesting. Julian Ashcombe arrived late, which Poirot suspected was habitual. He was Lady Ashcombe's nephew. One gathered this from a resemblance about the jaw, and from the easy proprietorial manner with which he occupied a room he did not own. He was handsome in the English way that goes slightly to seed in its middle 30s, and he smiled a great deal. Men who smile a great deal, Poirot had observed, frequently require people to believe things that are not entirely true. And then there was Madame Elvira Karska. She entered with the controlled drama of a woman who has spent a lifetime transforming her entrances into events. She was perhaps 50, strongly built, with dark hair shot through with silver, and eyes of an unusual amber colour that seemed to collect the candlelight and redistribute it on her own terms. Her accent was indeterminate, Central European perhaps, though polished to a surface that suggested long practice, in drawing rooms considerably grander than this one. Lady Ashcombe. Her handshake, Poirot noted, was firm and brief. The handshake of a woman who controls rather than yields. She seated herself and spent the first course in a survey of the room that she conducted with such apparent casualness that only Poirot perceived it for what it was: professional reconnaissance. Her gaze rested longest on Clara Wynne. "The young lady has grief in her aura," Madame Casca said suddenly, into a pause in the general conversation. What her voice was entirely conversational, as though she were remarking upon the weather. Clara's fork trembled. Barely. She did not look up. Julian laughed, a bright, social laugh deployed to fill an uncomfortable space. "Elvira, you really are marvellous. Do save it for tomorrow evening, won't you?" Lady Ashcombe said with a precision that silenced the table. "The séance is not entertainment, Julian. It is necessity." No one mentioned Edward's name. Poirot ate his soup and said nothing. But he observed that Dr. Wynne's hand, resting beside his wine-glass, had closed into a loose fist. After dinner, stepping out for a brief constitutional along the garden path, the evening air was cold and salt-sharp from the unseen sea below the cliffs. Poirot came upon Lady Ashcombe and Dr. Wynne in low conference near the stone balustrade. He turned a corner quietly, as was his habit, and was upon them before either had registered his approach. "You promised me," Lady Ashcombe said. Her voice was stripped of its dinner-table composure. "I promised you comfort," Wynne replied. His tone was the low, careful tone of a man who has had a particular conversation many times. "Not illusion, Margaret." She turned, and for one unguarded moment her face was entirely exposed to Poirot's observation. It was not grief he saw there. It was fury, white and contained and very old. Then she saw him. The composure returned so swiftly and completely that a less attentive man might have doubted what he had witnessed. "Monsieur Poirot," she smiled, "the air is rather sharp. You will catch cold." "You are most kind to concern yourself," he murmured, and retreated with a bow. In his room, later, Poirot lay awake in the too warm darkness while the sea beat its patient measure against the chalk cliffs below. He catalogued, as was his custom, the small things that did not yet cohere: the missing bishop, the rehung portrait, the sweetness in the air that did not belong, the two chairs at dinner placed a fraction too close together. Details as yet without significance, perhaps. Or perhaps not. Someone, he was certain, was not sleeping. He closed his eyes. The house breathed around him. Something was coming. Chapter 2. The Shape of Unspoken Things. Saturday arrived with a sky the colour of pewter and a wind that pressed against the windows as though testing for weakness. Poirot was at breakfast early, earlier than was expected of a guest he suspected, and found the dining room empty save for Thomas Briggs, who was adjusting the silver on the sideboard with the absorbed concentration of a man performing a private ritual. And they regarded one another in the particular silence that obtains between two people who are both, in different capacities, paid to observe. "An excellent household, Briggs," Poirot remarked pleasantly, addressing himself to the kedgeree. "We do our best, sir." The reply was correct to the syllable. "You have been with Lady Ashcombe long?" 8 years, sir." "Then you were here at the time of Mr. Edward's accident?" The pause that followed was perhaps a half-second too long. "Yes, sir. A very sad business." "Quite so." Poirot accepted more coffee. "The cliffs, I understand, can be treacherous in autumn." "They can be treacherous at any season, sir. Briggs said. And something in the flatness of the statement made Poirot set down his cup with fractional care. The butler withdrew. Poirot sat with his coffee and the low grey light and turned the half-second over in his mind like a coin he was not yet certain was genuine. What the morning arranged itself around the séance's approach in the manner of weather gathering before a storm. People moved through the house with a studied purposefulness that was, in fact, the opposite of purpose. The busyness of those who wish not to think. Julian Ashcombe, encountered in the library shortly before 11, was examining the bookshelves with the glazed attention of a man whose mind was thoroughly elsewhere. He turned at Poirot's entrance and smiled with the reflex speed of long social practice. "Poirot, settling in well? Beastly weather for it, but there we are." "I find the house most absorbing," Poirot said. His eye had already moved to the writing desk in the corner, its central drawer very slightly proud of its frame, as though closed in haste. "You have known Ashcombe Hall long, Monsieur Ashcombe." "All my life. I grew up spending summers here." Julian's gaze drifted towards the window with something that might have been nostalgia and might have been calculation. "Edward and I were great companions, you know. Very different, but yes, great companions." "He was some years your junior, I believe?" 3 years. A pause. "He had the more serious temperament. I was the one climbing trees and losing money at cards." He laughed. The laugh had the slightly too large quality of a sound made to fill a room. And yet," Poirot said gently, "you are here this weekend. At a séance in his honour, one might say." Julian's expression shifted, briefly like a cloud shadow crossing chalk. "One might say, Margaret, my aunt, takes these things very seriously. One doesn't argue with Margaret when she has decided upon a thing." "Non," Poirot agreed. "I observed as much at dinner." He left Julian to his bookshelves and his unconsidered drawer and went in search of the garden. The chalk cliffs lay some 200 yards behind the house, beyond a formal garden gone slightly wild with the season's end and a low stone wall that served more as suggestion than obstacle. Poirot walked with his hands in his coat pockets, his breath forming small, deliberate clouds in the salt air, and examined the ground with the methodical patience of a man reading a text in a language he has largely, but not entirely, mastered. The path from the garden to the cliff edge was clear enough, worn by decades of feet, the grass shorter and more compacted along its centre. But some yards to the left of the path, where the land dipped slightly before rising to the cliff's rim, the turf showed signs of older disturbance, a scuffing, a marking that 5 years of weather had softened, but not quite erased. Poirot stood at the cliff edge for a moment, looking down at the grey sea far below. The chalk fell sheer here. No gentle slope, no scrambling route. A man who went over this edge went over completely. He turned back toward the house and found Clara Wynne standing at the garden wall, watching him. She did not appear embarrassed to have been caught observing. She simply waited while he crossed the damp grass toward her, her hands folded before her with the stillness of a woman who has learned patience the difficult way. "You are thinking about Edward," she said when he was near enough. "I confess it." He regarded her with a courtesy that was also unmistakably interest. "You knew the cliffs well, mademoiselle?" "We walked them often that last summer." She spoke of the past with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed detachment and not quite achieved it. Edward said the sea was the only honest thing about Sussex. "He sounds," Poirot said, "to have been a young man of considerable perception." He was. Too much perception, perhaps, for this house. She glanced toward the hall, at its pale facade, its watching windows. He saw things as they were rather than as people wished them to be. It made him uncomfortable to be around, for some people. For which people, would you say? Clara was quiet for a moment. A gull passed overhead, crying once, a sound like torn paper. He had quarrelled with Julian the week before he died. I don't know the substance of it. Edward would not tell me, which means it was serious. He was not a man who withheld things from me lightly. She paused. He also seemed distracted in those last days, tired in a way that sleep did not cure. I thought it was the quarrel weighing on him. I thought that was all it was. She stopped. She had said more than she intended, and they both knew it. "You are most helpful, mademoiselle," Poirot said quietly, that she turned and went back toward the house without another word. He watched her go, the grey coat, the straight back, the slight tremor in the set of her shoulders that she would not have wanted anyone to see. He was still turning over her final sentence when, rounding the east corner of the house on his return, he encountered Madame Casca in the narrow service passage between the kitchen garden wall and the house's stone flank. She was alone, but she was examining the contents of a small glass bottle. Brown glass, unremarkable, with an expression of professional verification. She became aware of Poirot precisely 1 second after he became aware of her. The bottle was in her pocket before the second had fully elapsed. She was very good, but not, Poirot reflected, quite good enough. Not for a man who had been watching hands for 40 years. "Monsieur Poirot." Her smile was unhurried and did not waver. "I find the cold air necessary before a sitting. It clears the channels, shall we say?" "It is a discipline I can appreciate," he replied amiably. "You have been conducting sittings for Lady Ashcombe for some time, I think?" "Some years, yes. She is a woman of genuine spiritual sensitivity. And of considerable generosity, I imagine, to those who assist her in such matters." Madame Casca's amber eyes rested on him for a moment, with the flat, assessing quality of a card player's gaze. I offer a service," she said at last. "I am compensated. It is a relationship like any other." "Quite so." He smiled pleasantly. "I merely wondered, has Lady Ashcombe ever said anything to you in the intimacy of a sitting that has troubled you? That has seemed, shall we say, more confessional than spiritual?" There was a pause of quite a different character from the one Briggs had offered that morning. And this pause was not of concealment, but of rapid calculation. The pause of a woman deciding precisely how much to acknowledge of what she knows. "Grief is often confessional, Monsieur Poirot," she said at last. "It is one of its crueler properties." She went inside. Poirot stood in the passage for a moment, regarding the stone wall of the house and the patch of ground where she had stood. Near the drainage channel at the base of the wall, a single drop of brown liquid had fallen, and not quite dried. He crouched and breathed across it very carefully. Almonds. He rose, adjusted his coat, and returned to the house to dress for luncheon. The afternoon would pass. The evening would come. And in the drawing-room, around that long oval table, something would finally begin to show its face. He only hoped he would be quick enough to see it clearly before it disappeared. Chapter 3. Or the Dark and the Table. The séance was set for 9:30. By 8 o'clock the drawing-room had been prepared with a thoroughness that Poirot found instructive. The ancestral portraits had been partially screened by drapes of dark velvet. Lady Ashcombe's instruction, Briggs confirmed, with the neutral tone of a man delivering a verdict he has not been asked to render. The overhead chandelier had been extinguished, replaced by 3 candles in low holders arranged along the sideboard. The oval table had been cleared entirely save for a single object placed at its centre. The ivory bishop returned from wherever it had been these past several days, standing upright on the polished wood like a pale sentinel. Poirot paused in the doorway for rather longer than a casual observer might have paused. The bishop was back. It was, to every visible inspection, the same piece that had been absent from the cabinet. The same creamy ivory, the same carved mitre, the same proportions, and yet. He crossed to the table and bent to examine it without touching it, his hands still in his evening coat pockets, his eyes very close. It was the base that held him, a faint discoloration. Blue, barely there like the ghost of a bruise, clung to the ivory at the very bottom of the piece, where the flat foot met the table's surface. He straightened, turned to the cabinet, and compared the remaining bishop, its twin, with the dispassionate attention of a jeweller assessing a stone of uncertain provenance. The unstained bishop in the cabinet had a base worn smooth and ivory yellow with age. The bishop on the table had a base that was whiter, newer. He said nothing. He moved to his assigned chair and sat down. The company assembled at the table with the air of people committed to an entertainment. They are no longer entirely confident. They wish to attend. Julian took the chair to Lady Ashcombe's left, with the forced ease of a man determined to be seen as untroubled. Clara sat beside Dr. Wynne, who had the contained, braced expression of a physician entering a ward he disapproves of on clinical grounds, but cannot in courtesy refuse. Briggs stood against the far wall, not seated at the table, but present, as Lady Ashcombe had apparently required. His face was a wall. Madame Casca entered last, and she had dressed for the occasion with the considered drama of a woman who understands that theatre requires costume. The silver in her dark hair had been arranged to catch what candlelight there was. She wore deep red, which in the near dark read almost as black. She took her chair at the head of the table, opposite Lady Ashcombe, and settled herself with the unhurried authority of a conductor before an orchestra. "We will join hands," she said. Her voice in the dimness was lower, and more resonant, as though she had adjusted an internal register. "And we will be silent, if you please, until I indicate otherwise." Julian opened his mouth. Lady Ashcombe's glance closed it again. Hands were joined. Poirot's left hand received Clara's, cool and perfectly still. His right received the dry, papery grip of Dr. Wynne, who gave it with the resigned expression of a man shaking hands with a conclusion he cannot avoid. The candles produced a silence of their own. Either the wind had dropped outside, or else the velvet had absorbed it. The clocks had been removed from the room. Another of Lady Ashcombe's instructions Poirot had noticed earlier. Without their tick, time became a different substance, heavier, less accountable. Madame Casca breathed. Once, twice. The third breath was different, slower, drawn with a deliberateness that was either trance or the performance of trance. And Poirot, watching through his almost closed eyes, I was not yet prepared to say which. "There is a presence," she said at last. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. A young presence, one who left before his time. To Poirot's left, Lady Ashcombe's grip tightened on his hand. The room was very still. The bishop gleamed faintly at the table centre. And then, Madame Casca's head tilted back. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical convulsion of the popular imagination, but with the slow inevitability of a flower turning toward light. And from her throat came a voice that was not quite hers. Mother. A single word, hoarse and intimate, close, as though the speaker sat among them. Lady Margaret Ashcombe made a sound that was not a word at all. It was older than language, raw, undefended, entirely private. And it was, Poirot thought, the most painful thing he had heard in a long and instructive career. Then Clara screamed, or not the scream of fear. Poirot registered this distinction even as he rose from his chair, but something sharper, involuntary. She had lunged forward as the candles guttered wildly in a sudden draught, and her hand had struck the bishop as it fell. And in the flare of light that followed, Briggs had the overhead electric on within seconds, moving with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for precisely this. Clara stood with her hand to her mouth, staring at the figure slumped forward across the table. Madame Elvira Casca had not merely lost consciousness. She was, as Dr. Wynne established within 90 seconds of reaching her, quite dead. What followed was the particular chaos of a confined group confronted by the irreversible. Julian pushed back from the table and stood at its edge, making noises that were not quite sentences. A Lady Ashcombe had gone a colour that Poirot associated with shock of the genuine rather than the performed variety. A grey-white, almost translucent, the face drained rather than composed. Clara had not moved from her position. She was looking at the bishop. It lay on its side where she had knocked it. And there, newly visible at its base, recently carved into the ivory with something small and sharp, were 2 letters. E.A. He has spoken, Lady Ashcombe whispered. She said it as a woman might say a prayer, not to the room, but inward, to some private altar. Edward has spoken, Wynne said in a voice stripped of everything but professional precision. Margaret, come away from the table. She did not come away from the table. Poirot, meanwhile, had crouched beside the fallen medium. Her face was slack, already waxy at the temples, and there was, at the corners of her mouth, a faint residue. Barely detectable in the electric light, I easily missed. That spoke to him with considerable clarity. He rose without comment and moved to the sideboard where the evening's wine glasses had been arranged. One glass, Madame Casca's, still held a shallow residue. He bent and breathed across it without touching the rim. Almonds again. Unmistakable. He turned to find Julian watching him with an expression that was working very hard to appear merely curious. Extraordinary business, Julian said. Heart, do you suppose? It is always possible, Poirot replied pleasantly. Wynne had straightened from his examination, and now stood with the tight-shouldered look of a man arriving at a conclusion he would have strongly preferred not to reach. He said nothing to the room, but he caught Poirot's eye and something passed between them. The silent acknowledgement of 2 men who have arrived independently at the same unwelcome station. Briggs. Poirot's voice was quiet and entirely even. The decanter, the one that was set out specifically for this table this evening. Do not touch it further, and do not allow anyone else to do so. Briggs looked at him. There was, for just a moment, something in the butler's face that was neither deference nor indifference. Something urgent and suppressed, a sentence he was choosing not to speak. Then it was gone. "Very good, sir," he said. Lady Ashcombe had begun to weep. Silently, without gesture, much in the manner of a woman for whom weeping is too habitual a condition to require any outward performance. She was still looking at the ivory bishop and its carved initials, and her expression was one that Poirot had to look away from. It was not the expression of a woman who has witnessed a miracle. It was the expression of a woman who has, at last, been given what she asked for, and who suspects too late that she should never have asked. Chapter 4. To the fracture lines. The local police constable arrived at 11, summoned by Briggs with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been mentally summoning him since dinner. He was a young man, earnest, somewhat damp from the ride. And he managed the impossible situation of Madame Casca's body with the conscientious bewilderment of a person presented with a problem that exceeds his training by a considerable margin. Poirot observed him with sympathy and kept out of his way. It was understood, without anyone formally proposing it, that the household would not retire. They gathered in the smaller sitting room off the entrance hall, a room without the drawing room's freighted associations, and arranged themselves around it in the configurations that distress produces. Lady Ashcombe upright in the wing chair nearest the fire, Clara on the settee with her hands in her lap, Dr. Wynne standing at the window with his back 3/4 to the room. Julian poured himself a whisky with the decisive air of a man who has earned it, and then poured a second one and set it down untouched. Nobody spoke for some time. It was Wynne who broke the silence, and he did so by addressing the room's unaddressed fact with the directness of a man whose patience for obliqueness has finally run its course. "She was poisoned," he said, not unkindly, but without softening. Julian set down his glass. "You can't possibly know that from—" "I have been a physician for 32 years. I know what I know." Wynne turned from the window. His face in the lamplight was tired and something beyond tired. The face of a man carrying a weight that predates the present evening by a considerable distance. Prussic acid at a guess, in her wine. The smell is distinctive to anyone who has encountered it. "Then it was an accident," Julian said. "Some contamination in the—" "Julian." Lady Ashcombe's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Do not embarrass yourself." He subsided. Poirot, from his chair in the corner where he had arranged himself with a cup of tea and the mild expression of a man with no particular opinions, said, "There is a question of some delicacy that I should like to raise, if the company will permit." He paused. Had the decanter from which Madame Casca's wine was poured, was it set out specifically for the séance this evening, or was it drawn from the general household stock? A silence of a different texture fell. Poirot observed that Lady Ashcombe's eyes moved just briefly to Briggs, who stood in the doorway. "I prepared a separate decanter for the evening," Briggs said. "As instructed." "As instructed by whom?" "By Lady Ashcombe, sir. She felt that the occasion—" He paused, selecting his words with care. "That a certain separation from the ordinary domestic arrangements was appropriate." "Quite so." Poirot nodded pleasantly. "And between the preparation of this decanter and the commencement of the séance, where was it kept?" "On the sideboard in the drawing-room, sir, from approximately 7 o'clock. Accessible, then, to anyone in the house who wished to approach it during those 2.5 hours." The statement required no response. It received none, or which was itself a form of response. Wynne sat down heavily in the chair opposite Lady Ashcombe and addressed her with the weariness of very old familiarity. "Margaret, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, which I recognize is a great deal to ask at this particular hour." He waited. "Had Madame Casca given you any cause for concern recently? Any suggestion that her relationship with you had changed in character?" Lady Ashcombe was silent for a moment. In the firelight, her face was very still. The stillness not of composure, but of a woman deciding, with some precision, how much of the truth serves her present purpose. "She had been pressing me," she said at last, "for money. More than was our arrangement. She said she had expenses. She was not specific, but she was persistent. I found it distasteful." "When did this begin?" 3 weeks ago, perhaps 4. Wynne looked at Poirot. Poirot was examining the pattern on his teacup with every appearance of moderate interest. "And the ivory bishop," Poirot said, still regarding the teacup. "The one that was placed on the table this evening, with the initials carved upon it. Who placed it there?" "Madame Casca made the request," Lady Ashcombe said. "She said that a personal object belonging to Edward, or associated with him, would strengthen the connection. She had seen the chess set on a previous visit. The bishop was Edward's particular favourite piece, she said. She had an instinct for such things." The last sentence carried a faint, involuntary, defensive note. "And you provided it to her? Or did she collect it herself?" A pause. "I gave her access to the cabinet yesterday afternoon. She selected it herself." Clara, who had been silent so long that the room had adjusted to her silence as to a piece of furniture, said quietly, "Edward never had a favourite chess piece. He played chess badly and without enthusiasm. He said it was a game for people with too much patience and not enough conversation." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the constable's boots could be heard on the floor of the drawing-room. Julian said, in a voice somewhat smaller than his usual register, "So she invented it, the connection. She made it up to get her hands on the piece." "But why that piece?" Wynne said. "Why specifically the bishop?" Nobody answered. Poirot set down his teacup. He excused himself shortly afterward on the grounds of requiring air, which was true in the sense that all stated reasons are true, partially and selectively. He went not to the garden, but to the kitchen, where the cook, a stout and thoroughly shaken woman named Mrs. Partridge, was sitting with a cup of something fortifying and the expression of a person reconsidering her entire domestic career. He was gentle with her and interested, genuinely interested, which Mrs. Partridge, who had a precise instrument for detecting false attention, registered and responded to accordingly. "The almond flavouring," he said. "You use it in baking, I imagine." "For the marzipan, yes, sir, and the bakewell on Thursday." "And the bottle is kept?" "Larder, sir. Second shelf." She hesitated. "Though I will say, sir, I noticed last week it had been moved. It was on the counter. I assumed one of the girls had been at the baking without asking, but neither of them would own to it." "Last week," Poirot repeated. "Can you be more precise?" Mrs. Partridge considered. "Wednesday. I noticed it Wednesday morning, sir." "You have been most helpful," he told her, and meant it. He took the back stairs to the first floor, moving quietly in the manner that came naturally to a small, neat man in soft-soled shoes, and stood for a moment in the corridor outside the drawing-room where the constable was still conducting his earnest and insufficient survey. Through the half-open door he could see the oval table, the scattered chairs, and the bishop lying still on its side where it had fallen. He did not go in. He stood and looked at the bishop from the doorway, and he thought about a bottle moved on a Wednesday, and a decanter accessible for 2.5 hours, and a young woman's trembling fork at dinner, wasn't a portrait rehung in a room where a dead man's favourite chess piece turned out to have been no such thing. The pieces were assembling themselves, not yet into a picture, more at present like a table laid for a meal whose nature he had not yet been told. But the pattern of the laying was becoming clear. He heard a door close somewhere above him, and then footsteps, light, deliberate, and heading not toward the sitting room but toward the rear of the house. Poirot considered for precisely 4 seconds. Then he followed. Chapter 5. Confessions within confessions. The footsteps belonged to Julian Ashcombe. Poirot tracked them to the study at the rear of the ground floor, a small book-lined room that smelled of old pipe tobacco and accumulated evasions, and found Julian standing before the cold fireplace with a document in his hands that he turned face down against his thigh, with the smooth and unhurried motion of a man who has practiced precisely this gesture. Poirot, the smile arrived on schedule, couldn't sleep either. "I find," Poirot said, settling himself uninvited into the leather chair nearest the door, "that the mind does its most productive work in the small hours. It is less easily distracted." He allowed a pause. "You were looking for something specific, I think. Or verifying that something specific remains where you left it." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he sat down in the chair across the fireplace with the resigned air of a man conceding the first move in a game he suspects he will lose. "You're rather good at this, aren't you?" he said. "Not a question. I have had some practice. The document, Monsieur Ashcombe. You need not show it to me tonight, but I should tell you that whatever it contains, it will eventually be seen. These things have a way of insisting upon themselves." Julian looked at the paper in his hands for a long moment. When he spoke, the social gloss had worn away entirely, and what was underneath was neither charming nor frivolous. It was the voice of a man in genuine and long-standing fear. Edward found a letter, 2 years before he died. A letter I had written, to a man I owed rather a great deal of money. In it I had represented myself as having authority over certain estate funds that were not, strictly speaking, mine to represent. "Forgery," Poirot said pleasantly. "That is one word for it. It is the legal word for it. And Edward confronted you?" 6 weeks before he died. Julian set the document on the side table with the careful placement of a man relieving himself of a weight. "He said he would give me time to put things right. He was not unkind about it. Edward was never unkind. He said the estate had not actually suffered, which was true, and that if I cleared the debt and withdrew the letter, he would consider the matter closed." He paused. "He also said there was something else he needed to settle first. Something more serious than my letter, he called it. He wouldn't say what. And before he could settle it, he was dead. Yes." The word came out stripped and flat. "I have wondered, Poirot, and I have wondered every day for 5 years whether Edward died because of what he knew. Whether someone—" He stopped. But I couldn't say it, because saying it meant examining it, and examining it meant— He gestured at the room, the house, the sea beyond. "All of this," Poirot regarded him without expression. "The debt, it is still outstanding?" Julian's silence was answer enough. "I see." Poirot rose. "I should advise you to remain available, Monsieur Ashcombe. And the police inspector from Lewis will arrive tomorrow morning, and he will have questions that are less gently framed than mine." At the door he paused. "The document you came to verify. It is the letter you described?" "A copy of it. Edward made a copy. I found it in the study desk 3 days after he died, when Margaret asked me to sort through his papers. I have kept it here since. I know." He almost laughed. "I know precisely how that sounds." "It sounds," Poirot said, "like a man who could not bring himself to destroy the last thing his cousin wrote." He left Julian with that, which was, he felt, sufficient for one evening. He found Clara in the morning room at midnight, seated at the writing table with no paper before her and no pen in her hand, simply sitting in the attitude of a person who has been in that chair for some time and has not particularly noticed. She looked up without surprise. "I thought you might find me," she said. "Ah, you seem to find everyone eventually." "It is a habit that has occasionally proved useful." He took the chair across the table from her. "Mademoiselle Wynne, you have been carrying something since before this weekend began. I think it has become heavier since this evening, and I think you will find it a relief to set it down." She considered him, not the quick appraisal of a person deciding whether to trust, but the slower consideration of one who has already decided and is determining how. "Well, Edward told me he was afraid," she said at last. "Not of a person, or not initially. He said he felt wrong, physically wrong, tired in a way he couldn't account for. He had a weakness in his hands some mornings. He'd had 2 episodes of—" he described it as the ground tilting, dizziness severe enough to stop him on the stairs. Poirot was very still. "He went to your father," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, father examined him. Father said it was overwork and nervous strain." Her voice was entirely even, which told Poirot a great deal about the effort it cost her. But Edward didn't believe it. He said father had been evasive, that father had asked questions about the household meals, the wine, which seemed to Edward excessive for a diagnosis of nervous exhaustion. "He came to me that evening. He said, 'Clara.'" She stopped, drew a breath. "He said, if something happens to me—" I remember that I was not clumsy on stairs." The room was quiet. Somewhere in the house a timber settled. "Why did you not go to the police?" Poirot asked, gently but without deflecting the question. "Because 3 days later he was dead and I was 23 years old and I had nothing except the memory of a conversation that proved nothing. Because my father told me I was grief-struck and reading intention into coincidence. Because—" She pressed her hands flat on the table surface. "Because this house does not allow that kind of question. It absorbs them. It has been absorbing them for a very long time." "Your father," Poirot said carefully. "He treated Edward in those final weeks. Did he say anything to you then? Anything that, in light of what you have since considered, carries a different weight?" Clara was silent for a moment. "He said that Edward's constitution was weaker than it appeared. That some people decline in ways that look like accidents." She met Poirot's eyes. "I thought he meant it medically. I am no longer certain he meant it medically." Poirot walked back along the corridor toward his room as the house settled into its late-night stillness. He walked slowly, which was his custom when the grey cells were engaged upon a problem that had reached the stage of assembly. When the separate pieces had declared their nature and were waiting to be arranged into the configuration that would make sense of the whole. He knew now the shape of it. the slow poisoning. The physician who had understood what he was seeing and said nothing. The young man on the cliff already weakened, already dizzy, the ground tilting, as he had described it. And the fall that required no push because the poison had already done the necessary work. He knew the shape. What he did not yet possess was the architecture beneath it, the reason, the sequence, the particular human knot from which all this had grown. Outside his room he paused. Slipped beneath the door was a single sheet of writing paper, folded once. He picked it up with the corner of his handkerchief and opened it on his palm. 4 words in an unsteady hand. That the sea remembers everything. He stood in the corridor for a long time, looking at the note. The paper was the household variety, cream, watermarked, available on the writing desks in every room. The hand was not disguised precisely, but written with the deliberate unsteadiness of someone suppressing their natural formation. A person of education writing carelessly on purpose. He refolded it, still using the handkerchief, and went to his room. He did not sleep, but he lay in the dark and listened to the sea below the cliffs, its patient, indifferent rhythm carrying neither memory nor judgment. And he thought about a young man who had been afraid, and a physician who had been evasive, and a house that absorbed questions. By 3 in the morning he was quite certain of one thing he had not been certain of before. The poison that had killed Madame Casca was not the beginning of the story, or it was the second time someone in Ashcombe Hall had reached for the same solution. Chapter 6. The Hall of Mirrors. The inspector from Lewes arrived at 9 the following morning in a motor car that needed attention, and a manner that suggested he was accustomed to receiving it from others. His name was Croft, a solid, broad man of 50 with a grey moustache, and the watchful patience of a man who has learned that country houses yield their secrets more readily when you let them believe you are not particularly interested. He and Poirot assessed one another in the entrance hall with the swift, mutual evaluation of 2 professionals meeting on shared ground. Croft had heard of Hercule Poirot. His expression indicated that he considered the reputation somewhat in excess of the man's dimensions, which was a misjudgment Poirot had long since ceased to correct in advance. "I shall not obstruct you, Inspector," Poirot said. "I ask only to observe, and perhaps, in due course, to contribute." Croft said he supposed that would be acceptable, in a tone that communicated he supposed no such thing. They proceeded on this understanding. The morning was given over to formal interviews conducted in the library, which Croft appropriated with the ease of a man comfortable in borrowed rooms. Poirot sat in the corner with a notebook he did not write in, and the expression of a man whose attention is elsewhere, which ensured that no one directed their performance at him, and therefore no one adjusted it on his account. Lady Ashcombe submitted to questioning with the composed dignity of a woman who has decided in advance precisely where the limits of her disclosure lie. She confirmed the arrangement with Madame Casca, the private sittings, the financial agreement. So she described the séance preparations in accurate, selective detail. When Croft asked whether Casca had made any unusual requests in recent weeks, she said that Casca had wished to examine the ivory cabinet, for the purposes of the séance, as Poirot already knew, and that she had permitted this. She did not mention the escalating demands for money until Croft asked her directly, and at which point she confirmed them with the brevity of a woman acknowledging an inconvenient fact rather than a significant one. The performance was very good. It would have been entirely convincing to an inspector who did not know what Poirot knew. Wynne was next, and Wynne was the most interesting subject of the morning, not for what he offered, but for the particular quality of his withholding. He answered questions accurately, concisely, and in a manner that gave Croft nothing he had not already gathered. The diagnosis of poison, the identification of prussic acid, the time of death he had roughly estimated at some point between 9 and 9:40. He spoke with the authority of a physician submitting a report rather than a man under examination, which was clever. Authority, Poirot had observed, tends to move inquisitions sideways. Croft asked whether Wynne had had any prior professional acquaintance with Madame Casca. "None," Wynne said. "I had not met her before this weekend." "But you were acquainted with her reputation, through Lady Ashcombe, perhaps?" "Margaret mentioned her. I formed no particular opinion." "You disapproved of the séance?" "I disapprove of false comfort administered to the grieving," Wynne said. "That is a medical opinion, not a personal animus." "Quite so." Croft made a note. "And the late Mr. Edward Ashcombe. You treated him, I understand, and in the weeks before his death." A pause of 3 seconds, long enough to be heard, short enough to be attributed to reflection. "I did. He was suffering from nervous fatigue and some associated symptoms. Nothing in my clinical judgment at the time to cause serious alarm." In his corner, Poirot turned a page of the notebook he was not writing in. After luncheon, a meal consumed with the subdued, undistracted quality of food, eaten because the clock demands it rather than the body. Poirot took a turn about the first-floor corridor on the pretext of retrieving a book from his room, and used the opportunity to stand once more in the doorway of the drawing-room and look at the space where Madame Casca had died. The body had been removed. The table remained, the bishop still on its side among the debris of last night's disorder. Croft's constable had photographed everything, which was modern and thorough, and left the room feeling, somehow, more rather than less disturbed. Poirot studied the room from the doorway in the manner of a man reading a page for the second time, seeking what he missed on the first pass. The wine-glasses had been bagged and taken, the decanter likewise. The candles on the sideboard had burned to different lengths, one significantly shorter than the others, as though it had been lit earlier or placed in a stronger draught. He noted this and filed it. His eye moved to the velvet drapes screening the portraits. They had been drawn to the middle of each wall, obscuring the lower half of each painting. All except one. The drape on the near wall had been drawn slightly further, far enough to conceal not merely the lower portion of the portrait, but the brass plate at its base. The portrait in question was Edward Ashcombe's. Poirot stood very still for a moment, or the portrait had been moved before he arrived. He had established that from the dust line in his bedroom. But Edward's portrait, he now recalled, was not the one in his bedroom. That was a smaller study, evidently a copy or an earlier sitting. The large formal portrait in the drawing-room was a different work. He had not previously connected them. He connected them now. 2 portraits, both moved, both repositioned within the same week. He went to find Briggs. The butler was in the silver pantry, returned by the instinct of long service to the ordering of objects as a counter to the disorder of events. He looked up without expression at Poirot's appearance in the doorway. "The drawing-room portrait of Mr. Edward," Poirot said, dispensing with preamble. "It was moved recently, Within the past week, I think. Can you tell me when and at whose instruction? Something happened in Briggs's face. Not a crack exactly. The surface held, but a faint, yet internal shift, like the movement of water beneath ice. He set down the silver he was holding. Tuesday, sir. Lady Ashcombe asked me to rehang it. She said the light was wrong. The light in the drawing room in October, Poirot said, is the same light it has been every October for the past 30 years, I should imagine. At what point had the portrait previously hung? Some 6 inches to the left of its current position, sir. And what is behind the wall at its current position? The wall cavity. Is there access? The ice shifted again. This time it was unmistakable. There is a small recess, sir, behind a panel in the wainscoting. It was used, I believe, for the household strongbox in Lady Ashcombe's father-in-law's time. It has a latch on the interior side. And is it currently occupied? A pause of considerable duration. I could not say, sir. Could not, Poirot repeated gently, or would prefer not. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. His face was, Poirot thought, the face of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a specific number of years, and is becoming, with age, less certain that the carrying was the right decision. I was on the terrace the night Mr. Edward died, he said at last. I had gone out for air. It was near 11 o'clock. I heard voices near the cliff path. 2 voices, not one. I could not distinguish words, but you could distinguish number. Yes, sir. And you told no one. I told myself I had been mistaken. The words had the quality of a sentence rehearsed over 5 years, until it had worn smooth. It was dark. The wind was considerable. I may have been mistaken. Mais oui, Poirot said quietly. You may have been. He left the butler to his silver and walked back along the corridor to the drawing-room. He stood before the portrait of Edward Ashcombe, the young man with the serious face and the brass plate obscured by velvet. And he thought about a recess behind a panel, and a portrait moved 6 inches to the right, and a house that had been, for 5 years, rearranging itself around a secret. The question, he reflected, was no longer whether the secret existed. The question was whether he would find it before whoever had written that note decided that silence was no longer a sufficient strategy. Chapter 7. Behind the portrait. He waited until the house was at its quietest, the hour after luncheon when the English, whatever their private distresses, submit instinctively to a kind of suspended animation. And then he went to the drawing-room and closed the door behind him. And the room had the particular quality of a stage between performances, chairs displaced, the oval table still bearing the faint ring marks of last night's wine glasses, the velvet drapes half drawn and sagging at one corner where they had been disturbed by Croft's constable. The bishop lay where it had lain since Clara's hand sent it rolling. On its side near the table's edge, the carved initials visible from across the room. Poirot ignored it. He crossed instead to the wall beneath Edward's portrait and crouched before the wainscoting. The panelling here was old, painted over many times, the brushstrokes of successive decades laid one upon another like geological strata. But there was a section, some 18 inches wide and perhaps 2 feet in height, where the paint had been disturbed more recently. Not stripped or reapplied, simply pressed around its edges, or with the faint compression that comes from a panel opened and closed with some regularity. The latch Briggs had mentioned was not immediately visible. Poirot's fingers moved along the lower edge of the panel with the delicate attention of a pianist finding a specific key in the dark. A small brass catch recessed so as to be flush with the wood. He pressed it. The panel swung inward on hinges that had been, at some point in the not-distant past, oiled into silence. Inside the recess, perhaps 12 inches deep, the width of 2 house bricks, there was darkness and the smell of old wood and something else, the faint, dry paper scent of documents kept in an enclosed space. On the shallow shelf within, 2 objects lay side by side with the stillness of things that have been waiting in the dark for a considerable time. The first was an ivory bishop, unstained, its base worn smooth and yellowed with age, the patina of decades of handling, perfectly consistent with the chess set in the cabinet across the room. The original piece. The second was a small notebook, octavo size, bound in dark green cloth that had faded at the spine. Poirot took both objects out with the careful hands of a man who understands that what he is holding has been waiting 5 years to be found, and set them on the occasional table nearest the window where the thin autumn light, such as it was, fell directly. The notebook was Edward Ashcombe's, and this was evident from the first page, where a date and a brief heading had been inscribed in a clear, slightly cramped hand that conveyed education and a certain impatience with the formalities of penmanship. October 1928. Private record, not for family eyes. Poirot read it standing in the grey light, without sitting down. The entries were not daily, but occasional, written when something had been understood and needed to be set down. It in the manner of a man whose primary instrument of thought was not the page, but who had reached a point where the page was necessary. The early entries concerned estate matters. Julian's forged letter, which Edward had recorded in precise and unemotional terms, along with his decision to give his cousin time to resolve it. 2 entries later, a different register entirely. I have been unwell for 6 weeks. Alistair says nervous exhaustion. He is not telling the truth, or not all of it. Yet he examined me twice this month, and both times asked questions about the household table, what I ate, who prepared it, whether I drank wine at dinner or port afterward. These are not the questions of a man diagnosing strain. I have not challenged him directly. I am not certain what I would do with the answer. 3 pages further on, the hand had changed. Still recognizable, but slightly less controlled, as though written standing or in haste, or by someone whose hands were not entirely steady. I understand now what the questions meant. I have been testing the hypothesis for 2 weeks. When I eat from the common table, I am worse. When I dine in my room on food brought from the village, I am better. The pattern is not subtle once you know to look for it. I have said nothing to Alistair. I do not know whose instrument he is in this, or whether he is an instrument at all and not an architect. Mother does not know that I know. I am certain of that much at least. And then, on the final page, written with a steadiness that had a different quality to it. The steadiness not of a calm man, but of one who has resolved something and is at peace with the resolution. I intend to leave. Clara has agreed to come with me. I will take this notebook and Julian's letter and go to London and place both in the hands of a solicitor before I confront anyone here directly. I am putting this notebook and the bishop, which is a private joke and a private symbol, at the piece that moves diagonally to unexpected truths. behind the wall panel in the drawing room where I first found Julian's letter hidden 3 years ago, before he moved it to the desk. If I do not retrieve these things within a fortnight, someone should look for them. I will tell no one, except Clara, where they are. Poirot lowered the notebook. He stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular, or rather, looking at the arrangement of evidence that had assembled itself, and over the past 48 hours, into the shape of a story he had suspected in outline but could now read in full. The forged letter, the slow poisoning, the physician who understood what he saw and remained silent, the young man who had 3 days to act and did not, because within 3 days he was dead, and throughout 5 years, a house rearranging itself, a portrait moved to conceal the panel, séances conducted to appease a grief that was also, Poirot now understood, or a specific and terrible guilt. Money paid to a medium who had learned too much in private sittings, where a grieving woman's tongue had loosened in the dark. He knew who. He had known at some private level since the garden on Friday evening, since the face stripped of composure that had not been grief but fury, the fury of someone who has done an irreversible thing and cannot bear to have it reflected back at them. What remained was the matter of proof and the matter of method, or both were complicated in their different ways by the figure of Alistair Wynne. Wynne had known, or Wynne had suspected, which in a physician of 32 years' experience amounted, in Poirot's judgment, to the same thing. He had treated Edward's symptoms and recognised their cause, and said nothing. To the police, to the coroner, to anyone. The reasons for that silence were not obscure. They were, in fact, the oldest reasons in the human catalogue. Love, or the ghost of it, and the wish to protect. The terrible arithmetic of deciding which harm to prevent when all available options contain one. Poirot replaced the original bishop in the cabinet beside its twin, noting as he did so the immediate, obvious difference in the bases that should have been apparent to anyone who had looked. Then he took the notebook, wrapped it in his handkerchief, and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat. He was replacing the panel when the drawing-room door opened. Clara Wynne stood in the doorway. She looked at him. She looked at the wainscoting. She looked at the inner pocket of his coat where the notebook now rested. "You found it," she said. "Yes." He regarded her with the particular combination of compassion and directness that the moment required. "You knew it was there." "He told me. After he died, I could not bring myself to look. I was afraid of what it would contain." She paused, and then afraid, as years passed, that someone else would find it first. "Someone else did move the portrait," Poirot said. 6 inches to the right, to place it directly above the panel rather than to the left of it, where Edward originally hung it, to conceal rather than mark. Clara's eyes were very steady. "I know," she said. "I saw her do it." The afternoon light lay thin and cold across the drawing-room floor between them. "Then," said Poirot quietly, "I think it is time you told me everything you saw." Chapter 8. The Noose and the Net. Clara's account was short. It had the compression of something that has been held for a long time under considerable pressure. A statement reduced by 5 years of private rehearsal to its essential and irreducible facts. She had come downstairs early on Tuesday morning, 2 days before Poirot's arrival, 3 before the séance. She had not been able to sleep, which was habitual to her at Ashcombe Hall. The house had that effect. She had intended to take a book from the morning room and return upstairs without encountering anyone. She had encountered Lady Ashcombe instead. Margaret had been in the drawing room with the door ajar. Clara, passing in the corridor, had looked through the gap with the involuntary attention one gives to unexpected movement, and had seen her standing before the wainscoting, the portrait of Edward tilted forward on its hanging wire, her hands at the lower edge of the wall panel. Now the panel was open. Margaret had been reaching into the recess with the focused, deliberate movement of a person conducting a search rather than an inspection. Her hand moving carefully across the shelf within, feeling for something her eyes could not reach. She had not found the notebook. Clara knew this because she had watched Margaret's hand withdraw empty and had watched her face in profile. A face registering not relief, but a frustration that was very close to panic. Then Margaret had replaced the portrait with a precision that placed it 6 inches to the right of its original position, directly above the panel, concealing the compressed paint line at the panel's edge. She had stepped back, assessed the result, and left the room. Clara had stood in the corridor for a long time afterward. "You said nothing," Poirot said. Not as an accusation, as a fact requiring acknowledgement. "I had been saying nothing for 5 years," Clara replied. "It had become a kind of discipline, and I was afraid." She looked at her hands, not of her particularly, of what it would mean, what it would open. My father's silence, for instance, which I had known about and not spoken of either. We were all, she paused, searching for the word, complicit. In our separate, private ways, we were all complicit in the maintenance of a version of events that suited no one and that everyone had agreed to accept. "Until Madame Karska," Poirot said, "accepted it no longer." "Yes." He regarded her with a quiet, measuring attention. "The note that was placed under my door. The sea remembers everything. That was you." Clara did not look away. "I needed you to keep looking. I did not know how much you had understood or how quickly. I could not simply tell you directly. I had spent so long learning not to speak of it that even then, even wanting to, the words would not come in ordinary form." A pause. "I'm sorry it was oblique." "It served its purpose," Poirot said. "As did Edward's Bishop, a piece that moves diagonally," he wrote, "to unexpected truths." He looked at her steadily. He was a young man of considerable quality. Something in Clara's face shifted, not breaking, but changing register, like a key change in a piece of music. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence did not say more precisely. Poirot spent the remainder of the afternoon in preparation rather than inquiry. The inquiry was complete. What remained now was the architecture of revelation. The arrangement of the trap that was not, in his method, a trap at all, but simply the creation of conditions under which the truth, already known, could make itself undeniable. He went first to Inspector Croft, and laid before him, with economy and precision, the substance of what the notebook contained. The Croft listened with the expression of a man revising, page by page, an assessment he had considered settled. He was, Poirot had concluded by the end of the morning, a better inspector than his manner suggested. A man who would follow evidence where it led without excessive attachment to the direction he had expected it to go. "The notebook gives us Edward's account," Croft said. "It gives us his suspicion, his deductions. It does not give us proof of the poisoning, as such." "It gives us the pattern," Poirot said. "The pattern combined with Dr. Wynne's testimony, the testimony he has not yet given fully, but will, and with the evidence of the decanter from last evening, and with the almond essence from the kitchen removed on Wednesday, will constitute a chain of considerable strength. A jury, I think, will find it sufficient. And Wynne? Wynne knew. He cannot have failed to know. Whether he is charged as an accessory after the fact is a matter for the law rather than for me. But he will speak. Poirot said this with the calm certainty of a man who has looked at another man's face and read in it the exhaustion of a burden too long carried. He will speak because the alternative is to stand silent while Lady Ashcombe is tried and condemned without his evidence, which is more than his conscience. Even a conscience as practised in evasion as his will sustain. Croft looked at him. You'll want to conduct your own interview with her first. If you will permit it. I'll permit it, Croft said, in the tone of a man granting a concession while privately acknowledging it is not his to withhold. He went last to the ivory cabinet. He opened it and examined the bishop he had replaced. The original, unstained piece now returned to its position beside its twin. The two bishops stood side by side, one worn and yellowed with decades of handling, one whiter at the base, its carved initials E.A., barely visible in the afternoon light. He removed the substituted bishop, the planted one, the one Casca had selected from the cabinet, with Margaret's permission, and which had been doctored some time in the hours between collection and séance, and placed it on the mantelpiece, where it stood alone. Nor then he placed Edward's notebook, closed, in the centre of the oval table. He surveyed the room. The portraits gazed down with their painted patience. The remaining chess pieces stood in their cabinet. The candles on the sideboard had been replaced by a housemaid that morning. 3 fresh candles, unlit. The chair at the head of the table where Madame Casca had sat was pushed back at an angle as though its last occupant had risen in haste. Poirot straightened one of the candle holders, which was a fraction off centre. Then he went to inform the household that he would require them assembled in the drawing-room at 7 o'clock that evening, as there was a matter concerning the events of the séance, and certain events considerably prior to it, which required the attention of everyone present. He delivered this information to each person individually, and he watched their faces as he delivered it. Briggs received it with a stillness that had passed through anxiety and come out the other side into something resembling relief. Julian received it with a forced lightness that did not quite conceal the pallor beneath. Clara received it with the quiet steadiness of a person who has already endured the worst part, and knows that what follows is necessary rather than threatening. Wynne received it at the door of his room, and held the door open for a moment after Poirot had finished speaking, looking not at Poirot, but at some middle distance beyond his shoulder. Then he said, with the careful enunciation of a man choosing his words for the last time, "There are things I should have said 5 years ago." "Yes," Poirot said simply, "there are. I will say them this evening." "I know." He found Lady Ashcombe in the conservatory at the rear of the house, though standing among the late-season plants with the particular quality of stillness that Poirot had come to associate with her. Not tranquillity, but the suppression of its opposite, the stillness of a woman in perpetual, private effort. She turned when he entered and regarded him with those grey, level eyes in which he had seen, on the first evening, the shape of something he now understood completely. He told her he would require her presence in the drawing-room at 7, while she looked at the notebook in his hands for a long moment. He kept records, she said at last. It was not quite a question. He was, Poirot said, a meticulous young man. Something moved across her face then, something that was grief and pride and desolation all at once, intertwined so thoroughly that they could no longer be separated. She turned back to the window. He took after his father in that, she said quietly, and there it was, the last piece, delivered without stratagem, falling into its place with the soft, inevitable weight of truth, long restrained. Poirot left her among the plants and walked back through the house to dress for the evening. Behind him, in the conservatory, Lady Ashcombe stood for a very long time without moving. Chapter 9. All masks removed. They came to the drawing-room as the last of the daylight failed. Outside, the wind had settled to a low, persistent note against the sash windows. Not the rattling urgency of Friday evening, but something quieter, more considered, as though the house itself had run out of agitation and arrived at a form of exhausted attention. The fire had been lit. The candles on the sideboard burned steadily in the still air. At the centre of the oval table, Edward Ashcombe's green notebook lay closed, its faded spine catching the firelight. Poirot stood at the head of the table. The head that was not Madame Casca's end, but the opposite, the end nearest the cabinet. Inspector Croft sat to one side against the wall, notebook open on his knee, with the practised stillness of a man who has learned to render himself functionally invisible. He was, Poirot had concluded, a man of admirable professional restraint. They took their seats without instruction, as though the room's arrangement communicated its own imperative. Lady Ashcombe at the far end, upright in her chair with her hands folded on the table. The posture of a woman who has decided to receive whatever comes without the indignity of flinching. Wynne beside her, not looking at her. Julian to the right, his usual social ease entirely absent, replaced by the stripped, careful attention of a man who suspects he is about to hear things he will not be able to unhear. Clara at Poirot's left. Briggs standing as before, opposite the wall, though this time there was something different in his posture. A loosening as of a man who has set down a weight he will not resume. Poirot did not begin with the murder. He began instead with a question, addressed not to any individual, but to the room in general, in the mild conversational tone of a man raising a point of shared curiosity. "What is it," he said, "that a house preserves? Walls, yes, furniture, the portraits of the dead. But a house also preserves, does it not, the shape of the relationships formed within it, the tensions, the old bargains, the things said and the things very deliberately not said. Ashcombe Hall has been preserving something for 5 years. I think everyone in this room has known, in their particular and private fashion, what that something was." No one spoke. The fire settled. "Let us begin with the simplest facts," Poirot continued, "and proceed to the more complex. Madame Elvira Casca died on Saturday evening of prussic acid, introduced into the wine prepared for her use. The poison was obtained from the household supply of almond essence, removed from the kitchen larder on Wednesday of this week, confirmed by Mrs. Partridge, who noticed the bottle displaced on Wednesday morning. The drawing-room decanter was accessible from 7 o'clock onward, unattended, to anyone in the house who wished to approach it. The method required neither strength nor specialist knowledge. It required only opportunity, resolution, and a familiarity with the household's domestic arrangements sufficiently intimate that the risk of discovery was calculable in advance. He paused and looked at the table. Madame Casca was killed because she had become dangerous. She was a woman of considerable shrewdness who had conducted many private sittings with Lady Ashcombe over several years. Sittings in which grief, as is its nature, had loosened the tongue of a woman whose composure, in all other circumstances, is formidable. In those sittings, Lady Ashcombe had spoken, in fragments, in half-confessions, in the disordered unburdening of someone who has never been able to speak of a thing to anyone equipped to understand it, of the events surrounding her son's death. Madame Casca had listened, she had understood, and 3 weeks ago, she had begun to make use of what she understood. Lady Ashcombe's hands, folded on the table, did not move. The Ivory Bishop, Poirot said, was Casca's own addition to the theatre of the séance, selected by her from the cabinet with Lady Ashcombe's permission and taken away to be prepared. The initials carved into it were intended to suggest Edward's spirit as a presence, an accusation. The séance itself was designed to provide the maximum dramatic context for this suggestion, and, incidentally, to provide the maximum confusion under cover of which a woman might die and the cause be attributed, at least initially, to the shock of the occasion. He tilted his head slightly. It was not unintelligent, but it required the killer to act in a confined space, under observation, within a specific window of time. Such requirements produce a limited number of possible hands. And in this case, only one hand had both the opportunity and the knowledge of the household's arrangements that the method demanded. He looked for the first time directly at Lady Ashcombe. She met his gaze. Her face was the face he had seen on that first evening, stripped now of its last concealment. Not the grey, collapsed face of a woman caught, but something more complicated and more terrible. The face of a woman who has been waiting, for a very long time, for the particular relief of being seen completely. "You killed Madame Casca," Poirot said, to silence her. "That is the crime for which Inspector Croft will shortly charge you, and for which the evidence is, I believe, sufficient. But it is not the crime that made this weekend necessary. That crime is older." He opened the notebook to a page near the middle and laid it flat. Edward discovered he was being poisoned. He recorded the discovery here in this notebook, with the methodical care of a young man who had learned to distrust the version of events that this house preferred to present. He identified the pattern, the household table, the wine, the progressive weakness that Dr. Wynne examined and understood, and chose not to name aloud. Poirot's voice remained entirely level. Edward intended to take this evidence to London. He did not reach London. He died on the cliff path in a state of poisoned weakness that rendered the difference between an accident and an assisted fall largely academic. Julian said in a voice that came out smaller than he intended, "You are saying that Edward's death was—" "I am saying," Poirot replied, "that Edward Ashcombe died as the direct consequence of poison administered over a period of weeks. Whether what occurred at the cliff was an act of will or the final consequence of a weakened body losing its footing, that I cannot determine with certainty. Nor, perhaps, can anyone. But the poisoning itself is not in doubt." He looked at Wynne. Wynne was looking at the table. "Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot said quietly, "has carried the knowledge of this for 5 years. He recognized the symptoms. He asked the questions that a physician asks when he suspects arsenical poisoning. About the household table, about the wine. He drew conclusions that his position as a trusted family friend and his other attachments made it impossible for him to act upon. This is not a defense, it is an explanation. The law will determine what it amounts to. Wynne raised his head. His face was that of a man who has arrived, after a very long journey, at a destination he has been dreading, and finds that its reality, however grim, is preferable to the anticipation. "I knew," he said, simply, without qualification. "I knew, and I said nothing. I told myself there was not enough certainty, that I might have been wrong. I was not wrong, and I was not uncertain, and I have not slept without difficulty since October of 1928. The room was very quiet. "Why?" Clara asked. She addressed her father directly for the first time, and the single syllable carried the accumulated weight of 5 years. Wynne looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Because I loved her," he said. "I have loved her since before she was Lady Ashcombe. Since before she was anything other than Margaret Hartley in a garden in Surrey, 35 years ago. It is not a reason. I know that it is not a reason. But you asked why, and that is the truth of it." The fire burned. Somewhere above them the wind found a gap and moved through it briefly, or a sound like a caught breath. "There is one matter remaining," Poirot said more quietly now. "Edward was not Lord Ashcombe's son. Lady Ashcombe and Dr. Wynne have known this for 30 years. Edward, toward the end, had begun to suspect it. The notebook contains an oblique reference, a question about resemblances that he did not complete. He would have learned the full truth in time. Whether this knowledge played any part in what Lady Ashcombe feared, like in the complex and suffocating love that led her to act as she did, that is a matter for her conscience rather than for this room. He closed the notebook. "The Ivory Seance Killer," Poirot said very softly, "is not a creature of darkness, as such figures are commonly imagined to be. She is a woman who could not endure to be abandoned, not by a son who wished to leave, not by a secret she had protected for 3 decades. She held too tightly, and to hold too tightly, and when the thing held is a living person, is also a form of murder, even when the hands that hold mean only, in their deepest intention, to preserve." Lady Margaret Ashcombe exhaled. It was a small sound, but it had in it the quality of something very long compressed at last finding release. The sound, Poirot thought, of a woman who has been holding her breath for 5 years. "I only wanted him to stay," she said. "I know," said Poirot. "But understanding does not unspill poison. Madame." He looked across the table at Alistair Wynne, who was looking at his hands. "This," Poirot said, "is the cost of silence." Chapter 10. After the Storm. The house was very quiet by midnight. Inspector Croft had conducted his formal proceedings with a thoroughness that was, in its way, a form of decency. Not hurried, not theatrical. The inevitable machinery of consequence applied without relish. And Lady Ashcombe had listened to the charge with the same composure that had characterized her throughout the weekend, and had requested only that she be permitted to go upstairs to change before accompanying him. Croft, after a moment's consideration, had permitted it, with his constable in attendance. She had taken 35 minutes and descended in a coat of dark charcoal wool, her white hair precisely arranged. Her only concession to the occasion a slight additional pallor that the hallway's electric light rendered almost luminous. She had not said goodbye to anyone. She had not looked at Wynne. He had looked at her. But the look was not received, or if received, not acknowledged, and in the end it amounted to the same thing. They were gone by 11. The constable's motor car had crunched down the gravel drive and been absorbed by the darkness. And then there was only the wind off the sea, and the house with its lights still burning in the lower rooms, and the people left inside it attempting to determine what they were now to one another. Poirot sat in the small sitting room with a cup of tisane that had gone cold and listened to the house re-establish its rhythms around the absence at its centre. He was tired, not physically, precisely, but with the particular fatigue of a man who has spent several days in the company of other people's worst and most private hours. It was a tiredness that no quantity of sleep entirely repaired. He had learned long since not to expect that it would. Julian came to the doorway of the sitting room at 11:30. He stood there for a moment looking at Poirot with an expression that had been comprehensively stripped of its usual social equipment, and was therefore, for perhaps the first time, entirely his own face, younger than it generally appeared, and considerably more uncertain. "I should have spoken," he said, "about what I suspected, about Edward's letter, and what he had told me. I should have gone to someone." "Yes," Poirot said. He did not elaborate, and Julian, after a moment, seemed to understand that elaboration was not what was required. What was required was simply the acknowledgement, received without absolution. "I'm going to London in the morning," Julian said, "to see my creditors. The estate—" He stopped. "The estate will have to be sold, I imagine, given everything. I find I don't particularly mind." Poirot looked at him with a mild attention that was also, in its quiet way, a form of respect. "That is, I think, the correct instinct," he said. Julian nodded once, briefly, and went away. Wynne left Ashcombe Hall the following morning before breakfast, which was characteristic of a man whose courage, such as it was, manifested in private decisions rather than public declarations. He left a note for Clara, 2 pages, which she did not show Poirot, and which Poirot did not ask to see. He had said the previous evening in the drawing-room what needed to be said, and had said it fully. Whether the saying of it would eventually constitute repair or merely honest accounting, that was a question that belonged to Clara and to time, and to neither of them immediately. Your Clara herself, Poirot, found at the cliff edge at 8:30 in the morning. She was standing at the precise point where the chalk fell sheer to the iron-grey sea below, the same point at which he had stood on Saturday, reading the older disturbance in the turf. She was not close enough to the edge to cause alarm. She was simply standing, looking out, in the particular posture of a person not contemplating the drop, but the horizon, the long, flat line between sea and sky that has the quality, in certain lights, of a boundary deliberately placed. Poirot stopped some yards behind her and waited. After a time she said without turning, "He would have liked that you found the notebook." "I think," Poirot replied, "he would have liked better that it had never needed to be hidden." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved her coat. "I am going to leave Sussex. I don't know where. Somewhere without chalk. Somewhere that doesn't smell of the sea." A pause. "Is that a reasonable response to all this, do you think?" "It is an entirely reasonable response," Poirot said. "Though I would observe, mademoiselle, that grief travels with its owner. The sea does not follow, but grief has a notable talent for finding its way regardless." She turned then and looked at him with eyes that were dry and very clear. the eyes of someone who has moved through the worst of a thing and is standing now on the other side of it, in the unfamiliar open ground beyond. I know, she said, but the view will be different at least. She walked back toward the house without haste, her hands in her coat pockets, and Poirot stood at the cliff edge for a moment longer, looking at the sea. He turned back. Briggs tendered his resignation to the empty household that morning with a letter placed on the hall table, addressed to no one in particular. He was gone by 9. Poirot, descending the stairs with his luggage, found only the letter and the particular, well-polished silence of a house from which the last person with institutional memory has departed. His motor car was ordered for 10 o'clock. He had 40 minutes, and he used them in the manner he generally used unassigned time. Not idly, but in a kind of ordered recapitulation that served the same purpose as a musician's final chord. The resolution of accumulated tension into something that, if not peace exactly, was at least completion. He went to the drawing room. The fire had not been lit that morning. There was no one to light it. And the room was cold in the pale October sun that came through the tall sash windows and lay in long rectangles across the floor. The oval table was clear save for a faint ring mark from the previous evening's proceedings. Edward's notebook had been taken by Inspector Croft as evidence. The bishop that Karsker had doctored had likewise been bagged and removed. Poirot crossed to the ivory cabinet and opened it. The chess set stood complete. Both bishops present and accounted for. The original returned to its place, the substitute gone. All the pieces in their positions. He considered the set for a moment, the careful, intricate hierarchy of it, the way each piece moved according to its own logic and no other, the way the game rewarded patience and the capacity to hold the whole board in the mind at once, while attending to the particular square immediately before you. He closed the cabinet. Oh, the chair at the head of the table, Madame Karsker's chair, the head that faced the portrait of Edward Ashcombe, was empty. It had been pushed back at its angle since Saturday evening, and in the absence of any servant to correct it, there it remained, slightly displaced, slightly wrong, an asymmetry in an otherwise orderly room. Poirot studied it for a long moment. He did not straighten it. He crossed instead to the mantelpiece and stood before the portrait of Edward Ashcombe, the young man with the serious face and the good, clear eyes who had kept records in a green notebook and hidden a chess piece as a private symbol, and told the woman he loved, with the careful understatement of someone who does not wish to cause unnecessary alarm, to remember that he was not clumsy on stairs. Poirot stood before the portrait for quite some time. He was thinking, not in the precise, architectural way of the investigation, when the grey cells were engaged upon a problem, and the mind moved with the purposeful economy of a machine well suited to its task, but in a quieter, older fashion. He was thinking about a mother's hand reaching in the dark, towards something she was already losing, about the terrible arithmetic of love that has become possessive without understanding the moment of its own transformation, about what it costs a man to know an irreversible thing and choose, like for 30 years, the company of the person who committed it. He had seen a great deal of human nature in his long career, and it had not made him cynical. This surprised some people. It did not surprise Poirot, who understood the distinction between knowledge and despair, and had long since chosen the former without the latter as his operative condition. Outside, the motor car arrived on the gravel. He heard it. He took his coat from the chair where he had laid it, and paused at the door of the drawing room, looking back once at the cabinet, the empty chair, the portrait, the long rectangles of morning light across the floor. At breakfast, before the motor car had come, his cup of tisane had been placed fractionally off-centre on its saucer by the housemaid who had, apparently, other things on her mind. He had corrected it without thinking, or with the instinct so automatic as to be beneath the threshold of decision. He paused now, remembering this. He thought of a hand. Not the housemaid's hand, but an older hand, more desperate, reaching into a wall cavity in the dark for something that was no longer there. Reaching and finding nothing because the thing it sought had been waiting, in the dark, for someone who would know how to read it. He picked up his bag. The sea, as he descended the drive, which was the colour of old pewter and entirely indifferent. It moved in its patient, recursive way along the base of the chalk cliffs. The same movement it had made before Ashcombe Hall was built, the same it would make after, carrying nothing forward, releasing nothing back. In the pale October morning, Hercule Poirot got into his motor car, settled his coat about him with his characteristic precision, and did not look back at the house. He had found what there was to find. The rest belonged to the living.